Hello and welcome back to the Modern 80, a channel designed to encourage American men to stay on their purpose and be the best citizens they can be to help steer our culture in a direction that's beneficial for all. This is going to be the part 2 of the religion series that covers the sources that have influenced me and that I will use to convey information along the length of the series, which I do not know. I don't know how many videos it's going to be, but I want to make it sizable chunks for people to really get some good information and visit and revisit, share with other people. So I'm just going to jump right to it in this segment, and I'm going to introduce the first source of the American Christianity series. Okay, so for our first source, it's going to be a documentary from 1999 called The Real Jesus Christ, directed by Patrick McGrady. Here are a few words about it right now.
At the time of this recording, one could view The Real Jesus Christ by Patrick McGrady on Pluto TV. It's a free streaming service. This documentary is not great. Not in the sense that it's full of misinformation or is mean-spirited or anything like that. It simply runs into the problem that anyone faces when they try to convey the message that I'm trying to convey, which is that any study of the origins of the Christian church just reveals an anticlimactic set of characters and events that are not unlike other famous revolutions, or would-be revolutions, throughout history. The obvious difference being the influence that a certain version of Christianity had on the powerful people who encountered it, like, say, Constantine. The challenge with presenting this information is where to start. It's almost like when people talk about the possible conspiracy surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Ultimately, as a matter of history, any conspiracy can't be proven at this point, perhaps in part because of the actions of possible people who would wish for things to be concealed. So the burden of the person trying to bring things to light is where to start. Does one start with Lee Harvey Oswald, with Dallas's Dealey Plaza and the grassy knoll, the magic bullet, or the mysterious death of witnesses? It's the same thing with the origins of the Christian church. Do you talk about New Testament authorship and the dating of those documents? How about miracles? Do you start directly with Paul? James, the brother of Jesus? Where does the argument about circumcision and rituals surrounding food fit in? This documentary chooses, as you can tell by the title, to focus on Jesus himself. Makes logical sense. But the issue with that is there's almost nothing about the man written outside of the Gospels, and any exploration of the actual life of the man from a historical perspective is impossible. We essentially only have the Christian narrative. But that's also, ironically, where the intrigue starts. Because though we only have the Gospels that speak on a brief section of his brief life, we do have a wealth of information on the times he lived in. See, the Jesus narrative runs into trouble when the events surrounding the description of his life comes in conflict with what we know about the times in which he lived. The filmmakers knew this, and they tried to tackle this issue by using the biblical version of Jesus' life as a timeline and trying to explain inaccuracies of the story we all know along the way. The documentary is presented with a mystery-solving framework that's meant to be engaging for initiates, while familiarizing such a person with the biggest pieces of information with which a person would need in order to have a common frame of reference for this discussion. In short, the reason why I recommend this paltry hour-long documentary is that, by itself, it's a Cliff Notes version of the exposition on the most important talking points of the subject.
Okay, the next source is from 2014. It's a book called Zealot by Reza Aslan. Perhaps you've heard of it. Let me tell you something. In 2014, this thing set off a little bit of a firestorm. When I finally read it, I saw why, and it is worth every bit of praise and criticism and attention. That's the word I'm really looking for. That it garners. So here's a little bit about why.
I present Reza Aslan's book as a sort of compendium to the Real Jesus Christ documentary. Now, the documentary came before the book, but it views like a really bad adaptation of Zealot. I know what I said earlier about the documentary being a Cliff Notes version to what a person needs to know, but Zealot actually is that Cliff Notes version. Also, in reference to the where to start question that I had about the documentary, I believe that Zealot starts perfectly, the author's short autobiography aside, by describing first century Palestine as told by the accepted historical sources. Indeed, the actual title of the work is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus Christ. The premise of the book answers the issue that there are no, at least surviving, non biblical works about the life of Yeshua of Nazareth that are contemporary with the Gospels or the authentic letters of Paul that came before the Gospels. Aslan embraces the concept of knowing the man through the times. For instance, say someone wanted to know about you, but there's hardly any direct information on you except some of your associates, one or two major events in your life surrounding a cause that you're passionate about, and your passing. The historian would have to admit that he can say nothing definitive about you. However, one could make a reasonable guess about your attitudes knowing things about the time you lived in. What decade did you grow up in? What part of the country? What ethnicity were you? What was your socioeconomic status? What did your parents do for a living? Whether or not your parents were even together in your formative years? Whether or not you had a criminal record? Whether or not you graduated high school or college, etc. Just like how one can extrapolate certain truths based on these things about a person for which almost nothing is written, Aslan applies this method to Jesus of Nazareth. And when one combines the times that he certainly lived in from history with a critical reading of the Gospels, keeping in mind what the Gospels were trying to accomplish, you get a Jesus with which most people are not familiar, but makes a ton more sense.
The next source is a book by James Tabor that was released in 2012 called Paul and Jesus. Here's a little bit about it.
With the broad strokes covered by an hour-long documentary and fleshed out a bit by Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus Christ, the particulars of the schism in the early church is explored in industry-leading detail by author James Tabor. Paul and Jesus is one of the main sources Aslan uses in his book to cover the issue of the doctrinal split of the first century church. This book will help people who have never looked into this realize exactly what happened between the two distinctly different ideas that took hold of the church less than 20 years after Jesus died. And for me, the most damning information to what I believed, as it's proved that the unified church narrative that's preached every Sunday in almost every Christian denomination on earth is just plain false.
Okay, fourth up, from deep within the annals of history comes The Jewish War or War of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. Here's a little bit about it.
Next, I think it's important for anyone that takes this journey to have their own copy of The War of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. You can read the entire work if you want to. I certainly did not. But the work plays a huge part in what we understand about the first century in Palestine. It's constantly referenced, and I think it's important for anyone to read those references from the source. Not to give too much away, but the description that Josephus gives of the three main religious groups of the time is incredibly impactful, or at least it was to me.
Last and certainly not least is the Bible itself. Hopefully you have one handy. Here's a couple of my thoughts about that.
One of the most shocking things someone who takes this journey is going to realize is that though it seems like the New Testament stands in opposition of what you've heard me talk about up until this point, and yes, it generally does, what you'll notice inside its pages are conspicuous remnants and evidence of the very things that would have us doubt the narrative that people tried to create. Let me say that again. Though the narrative has been shaped from the beginning by Christians over the centuries into their version of Christianity that we're all familiar with, there are undeniable sections of the New Testament itself where that very narrative is betrayed. And, ironically, it's concealed over the centuries by apologetics that were in the know and presented to the masses to this day by people who are ignorant of such apologetics. A note on the Bible. I highly recommend that you get a translation other than the King James Version. I know that people feel very close to this version, but unless you speak 17th century English, I do not recommend it as a learning tool. I mean, how's your Shakespeare? Now, you can really use almost any translation you want, but I recommend the New International Version from 1984. There is a newer version of the New International Version, but for reasons I will not get into here, I just plain don't like it. Furthermore, it might be a little difficult to find a version of the 1984 NIV because it's been superseded by the newer NIV, but if all you can find is the newer NIV, that'll do. So, those are going to be our sources for this video journey we're going to take. The documentary The Real Jesus Christ, Zealot by Reza Aslan, Paul and Jesus by James Tabor, The Jewish War by Flavius Josephus, and the Bible itself. Hit like, share, and subscribe. Also, you might want to bang that bell to be notified when the next video is released, where we will set the stage for our discussion and learn about the setting for the story, first century Palestine. This has been The Modern 80. I'm Odium with a reminder to all men to stay on your purpose and be a contributing, interdependent citizen. Thanks a lot. See you next time.